Developers and publishers often don't seem to understand that the more they hype up their games, the more they're going to have to live up to. Seems like simple logic, right? Well, several high-profile disappointments over the years have shown us that it's not nearly as commonly understood as you'd expect. Here, we'll be talking about 15 first-person shooters that made massive promises in the lead-up to their launch, but ended up falling short of expectations. Before we go ahead, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos every single day, and your support really helps us out. With that out of the way, let's start. Halo 5 Guardians. 343 Industries weren't exactly in an enviable position when they took the reins of the Halo franchise from Bungie, but even so, Halo 4 was a respectable, albeit imperfect first outing for them. After that, everything just went downhill. The Master Chief Collection had a terrible launch that it would take years to recover from, while Halo 5 just continued that downward spiral, thanks to a disappointing story that for some reason decided to shift focus away from Master Chief. Fallout 76. The very point of a Fallout game is for players to be able to meet bizarre characters in the series' post-apocalyptic landscapes, undertake memorable quests, and create unforgettable moments thanks to the series' emergent mechanics. Fallout 76 decided to take all of that away, with no NPCs, disappointing quest design, and a vast array of technical issues that went far beyond the terrible lows that even the historically glitchy output of Bethesda had ever managed. Thankfully, Bethesda has since managed to turn things around with a string of solid content updates for the game, but back when it first came out, Fallout 76 was a massive disappointment. WOLFENSTEIN YOUNGBLOOD. The fact that WOLFENSTEIN YOUNGBLOOD wasn't Wolfenstein 3 certainly helped temper expectations a bit, and as such helped cushion the blow of its disappointment. Even so, it didn't do what fans of the series wanted it to. Its story was largely disappointing, not least because of how it sidelined BJ almost completely, while even on the gameplay front, a number of poor decisions dragged down the experience. From forced loot and RPG mechanics harming the combat, to the semi-open world approach of the game hurting the pacing. Not a terrible game by any means, but not nearly good enough to keep fans happy until the launch of Wolfenstein 3, which cannot come soon enough. CYBERPUNK 2077. Cyberpunk 2077's failure is recent and fresh, so surely most don't really need a reminder on what happened there, but it bears repeating. After the success of The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red found themselves beloved by players around the world, and they developed a reputation for excellence and for being pro-gamer. Much like so many other developers behind the games on this list, CDPR tapped into that reputation hard, promising a game that would be every bit as defining as The Witcher 3 had been, and cashing in on the goodwill that they had earned with it to keep the hype going through innumerable delays. What they promised, a mix between GTA's immersion and dynamic reactivity and their own strong writing, excellent quests, and great RPG mechanics, was certainly exciting to say the least. On almost every single front, however, Cyberpunk failed to deliver, at the very least to the extent that it promised to deliver. Even once you remove the shoddy state that the game launched in and just looked at it for what it is, separate of all of the hype, it's simply not a particularly great game. Despite a few infrequent flashes of brilliance, on the whole, this was an average game hyped up to be the next milestone for the medium. And that, along with the literally unfinished state it launched in, tarnished its legacy, as well as that of its developers, in a way that will be really hard to recover from. BRINK. Splash Damage's BRINK certainly had the elements in place to craft something special, from its vibrant setting to its parkour-focused movement and shooting, but the game definitely needed more time in the oven. Combat lacked the oomph that you'd want in a shooter, the campaign was largely underwhelming, and the game was also plagued by a host of technical issues. This is a classic case of a game that evidently had a lot of potential, which was squandered by shoddy execution. Aliens, Colonial Marines. A complete and total mess, if we're being perfectly blunt about it. Aliens, Colonial Marines was everything an Alien game should not be. It was plagued by technical issues that made the game nearly unplayable, and had blatantly downgraded visuals as compared to what was shown off pre-launch, while terrible AI and bland, uninspired combat encounters seemed to totally misunderstand what the property was all about. It's definitely one of Gearbox's biggest, most high-profile failures, though not nearly as big as the game we're going to be talking about next, though. Duke Nukem Forever. Where do you even begin with this one? In the wake of id Software's shooter revolution in the 1990s, many imitators followed, and we got some great games out of that too, with one of the most beloved ones being Duke Nukem 3D, a game that made its mark as much for its irreverent humor and meta commentary on things as it did for how it played. Following its success, there was a lot of confidence in almost everybody that Duke Nukem Forever would be the great next-generation realization of that series. But 15 years, multiple false starts, and a relegation to vaporware status were not enough to kill this game. Through thick and thin, in spite of every single thing going wrong during development, Duke Nukem Forever somehow managed to eventually launch, and ended up being an outright bad game. A lot of the criticisms around the game stated that it was stuck in the 1990s, but honestly, if Duke Nukem Forever had launched as it is in the 1990s, it still would have been a bad game. It was a Frankensteinish mishmash of a troubled birth, and the final game that we got was decidedly not worth the wait or the trouble it must have been to get the damn thing out at last. Killzone. At a time when Halo had taken over the entire industry and revolutionized the FPS genre, pretty much every developer and publisher was scrambling to chase the trend and come up with its own Halo. As Xbox's chief competitor, Sony decided to do the same, and tasked Guerrilla Games with building what they would go on to market as the Halo Killer, which was, as it turned out, quite unwise of them. A bland art style, boring story, several technical issues, and shooting that was let down by inconsistent AI, combined in what turned out to be a major disappointment. Guerrilla would eventually make good on their promise with the excellent Killzone 2, but the series didn't exactly have the best of starts. Umbrella Corps. Until its reinvention with Resident Evil 7 in 2017, Capcom's beloved survival horror franchise was in the worst shape of its life, and was making one bad call after another. Nothing exemplifies that better than Umbrella Corps, which, if we're being mild about it, was a blatant cash grab that failed in almost every way possible. Capcom tried to cash in on the PvP shooter craze with Umbrella Corps, but not only did they make the terrible decision of doing so in a Resident Evil game, they didn't even have the good sense to, make a good game. Even the biggest Resident Evil fans will tell you that finding any redeeming qualities in this game was a tall, tall order. Destiny. After setting the world on fire with the revolutionary Halo series, Bungie decided to move on and try something new. With Destiny, they promised something that would be similarly revolutionary, a shared world looter shooter at a time when neither of those things were nearly as common as they are today. At launch, however, Destiny was a major disappointment. Its shooting mechanics were typically excellent, but nearly everything around that, from the disappointing lack of content to the underwhelming story to the repetitive quest design, was a huge letdown. Bungie eventually managed to turn things around and turned Destiny into a much better game, but they didn't exactly make a great first impression with it. DAIKATANA. The sheer hype and anticipation behind DAIKATANA is really hard to explain to anyone who wasn't there at the time. John Romero, along with John Carmack, literally wrote the book on so many video game paradigms. First-person shooters exist today because of the man, and so much of their language and iconography, including how movement and combat are handled, or multiplayer and online, comes from his work. So obviously, a brand new game that he promised would be his greatest yet was going to draw all eyes on it, right? I mean, how could it not? The game that was ultimately released, however, was flaccid and underwhelming. While the backlash to it has made it seem worse than it was most definitely not even close to achieving the heights Romero's older games achieved. DAIKATANA's failure would go on to put a premature end to Romero's career, and it would take decades before he would venture back into making full-fledged games once again. Call of Duty Ghosts. Call of Duty Ghosts was a bit of a damp squib. Call of Duty Ghosts was an underwhelming, generic game that seemed all too happy to rehash what other shooters had done, while a disappointing single-player campaign only served to exacerbate its issues. Definitely one of the most forgettable Call of Duty games to date. Homefront: The Revolution. The first Homefront was already a disappointing case of squandered potential, but sadly its successor didn't fare much better. Like the first game, Homefront: The Revolution wasn't without its strengths, but those were outweighed greatly by its many issues. From its technical issues to a bland story, from repetitive design that got boring very quickly to shoddy execution of mechanics that, on paper, seemed like winners, Homefront: The Revolution ended up being a sore disappointment that failed in the most fundamental ways, and once again ended up squandering its inherent potential. Rage. id Software is flying high right now, but about a decade ago, the studio was really struggling. And those struggles personified themselves as Rage in 2011, a game that definitely had plenty going for it, but just couldn't live up to all the expectations people had from it. No amount of excellent shooting and impressive visuals, both of which Rage boasted, could make up for its drab, empty world, its uninteresting story, which may as well have been non-existent, its repetitive quest design, and any number of other major issues. Star Wars Battlefront. People were understandably excited about a new Star Wars Battlefront game. That name, for starters, carries undeniable expectations with it. But more than that, how could anyone not be excited about a AAA multiplayer Star Wars shooter being developed by the incredibly talented people at DICE? Well, it turned out that DICE and EA ended up putting too much stock in the power of the Star Wars brand, which meant that the game itself was compromised. Mechanically, it was an exceptional product, but it was severely lacking in several other ways. Not only was its lack of a single-player component disappointing, even its multiplayer offerings were surprisingly sparse at launch. While the game also launched at a time when EA's aggressive monetization policies were at their most obnoxious, something that would be taken to even greater extremes with its sequel's launch in 2017. Battlefront was, of course, a game that one could sink dozens of hours into, especially once it had received more content with post-launch support. But it was also far from being as good as it could and should have been. And with that, we reached the end of the video. Have anything to say? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we upload new videos every single day on Gaming Bolt, so please consider subscribing, as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching.